I don't know why we don't hang out more. And you're just like such an amazing story. You're like just so successful, and what an amazing career that y'all have had.
Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen were America's sweethearts, two little girls who captured hearts on Full House before building an empire worth hundreds of millions. But behind the matching outfits and million-dollar smiles was a story that's far darker than anyone realized. From being thrust into Hollywood at 9 months old to the mysterious circumstances surrounding a celebrity death, from public battles with addiction to a marriage that ended in one of the strangest ways imaginable, the twins have lived through experiences that would break most people. What really happened to the girls who seemed to have everything? The truth is more heartbreaking than you think. The Heath Ledger Mystery. January 22, 2008. A masseuse named Diana Wolozin arrives at a Manhattan apartment for a 3 o'clock appointment with Heath Ledger. She walks into the bedroom and finds him lying face down on the bed, not moving, not responding to her voice. It's the kind of moment that usually sparks an immediate call to emergency services, but that's not what happened. Instead, Diana reached for Heath's phone and dialed Mary-Kate Olsen. Not once, several times. This detail confused people then and still confuses people now. Mary-Kate wasn't in New York, she wasn't a doctor, she wasn't even someone most people knew was in contact with Heath at all. Yet she was the first person contacted, as if she was somehow the one expected to handle whatever was unfolding. When Diana eventually got through to her, Mary-Kate didn't call 911. She sent her personal security team to the apartment. Minutes slipped by, long enough that those 9 minutes became one of the most dissected timelines in celebrity news. By the time paramedics were finally called and arrived, they worked on Heath for more than half an hour. Nothing changed. He was gone. 28 years old, at the peak of his talent, with his Joker performance still months away from shaking the film world. The medical examiner later determined he died from a mix of prescription medications, painkillers, anti-anxiety medicine, and sleeping aids. The kind of cocktail that becomes lethal without anyone realizing how dangerous it is. The public learned quickly that something unusual was going on behind the scenes. Almost no one knew Heath and Mary-Kate had any kind of relationship. They had kept things extremely private. In fact, their connection only became public because of the way events unfolded that day. Friends later shared that they had been spending time together casually for a few months. It wasn't serious, but they seemed to understand each other's habits and routines. They went to the same New York spots, ran in overlapping social circles, and lived fast-paced lives that blurred late-night energy with young Hollywood burnout. When investigators stepped in to determine how Heath ended up with multiple controlled medications, they asked to speak with Mary-Kate. She wasn't accused of wrongdoing, but because her number was called repeatedly at the moment of crisis, she became part of the timeline they needed to understand. Her response raised eyebrows immediately. Through her legal team, she said she wouldn't cooperate unless she received immunity. That choice added even more mystery to a situation already packed with unanswered questions. Her lawyer insisted she wasn't connected to the medications found in Heath's apartment and had no knowledge of where he got them. Investigators eventually closed the case, and she never sat for an interview. To this day, Mary-Kate has never publicly spoken about Heath, their relationship, or what happened on the day he died. Months after his passing, she was asked about him in a magazine interview, and she shut the topic down instantly. She didn't offer memories or reflections, just silence. That silence has fueled speculation for more than a decade, because the public rarely sees someone refuse to discuss a situation so completely. People have come up with all kinds of theories about her involvement, most of them unsupported, some of them flat-out sensational. But the fact remains, the timeline around Heath's final hours includes her name in places no one expected. No matter how innocent her role may have been, the unanswered nature of those details keeps the conversation alive. It didn't help that paparazzi photographed her visibly distraught in Manhattan just days after Heath's death. She looked overwhelmed and devastated, suggesting their relationship was more emotional than anyone realized. To understand why that tragedy hit her so hard, you have to look further back, to the childhood Mary-Kate and Ashley lived, the pressures they carried, and the way their early fame created patterns they would spend years trying to untangle. And that path, once you start tracing it, leads to some of the darkest chapters of their lives. Chapters most people never knew the full weight of. Childhood stolen. The twins were born on Friday, the 13th in June, 1986, which almost feels symbolic, considering how much of their early lives ended up being shaped by circumstances completely outside their control. By the time they were 9 months old, they were cast on Full House, their very first audition. Producers chose them over hundreds of other twins, not because the girls had talent yet, but because they were small, calm on camera, and easy to schedule around. They were babies who suddenly became the center of a hit sitcom, long before they were old enough to understand what any of it meant. Because of strict labor laws, the twins weren't allowed to work longer than 20 minutes per episode, which meant they were swapped constantly throughout the day. One would be taken off set, the other brought in, often mid-emotion or mid-scene. Adults moved them around like props, all while trying to coax smiles, reactions, and lines out of them on cue. For the girls, this was normal life. They didn't know anything else. Even their earliest days on set were complicated. John Stamos later admitted that working with infants was incredibly hard. The constant crying, feeding, and sleeping schedules, it was frustrating for the cast and crew, and the twins ended up being temporarily replaced by another set of babies. That experiment lasted only a short time, though, because the replacements proved even harder to work with. The production quickly brought Mary-Kate and Ashley back. From then on, the twins were cemented into the show, whether they enjoyed being there or not. As they grew, their personalities began to diverge. People who worked on set have said Ashley tended to be more compliant, while Mary-Kate struggled with the demands. When one twin resisted the stress of filming, the other was expected to compensate. These weren't teenagers capable of voicing boundaries, these were toddlers. And instead of asking what they wanted or how they felt, the solution was always to keep the machine running. Their childhood became even stranger when their physical differences became a problem for continuity. They didn't lose their baby teeth at the same time, which caused a mismatch on camera. So producers had them wear tiny dentures to keep Michelle Tanner looking consistent. They were still in preschool, being fitted for fake teeth simply to maintain a perfectly marketable character. When Mary-Kate reflected years later on their early career, she described feeling disconnected from pictures of herself as a kid, almost as if she had missed her entire childhood. The two of them became known for that monkey performer mindset, trained from infancy to behave, smile, and deliver. And when you hear that from someone who lived through it, you start to understand just how unnatural their upbringing truly was. By the time Full House ended in 1995, the twins were 8 years old. Most kids at that age are learning how to ride a bike or figuring out long division, but Mary-Kate and Ashley were already household names. They were millionaires before they even hit second grade. And with that fame came expectations. Instead of slowing down when the show wrapped, their world actually got busier. Their parents' decision to build dual-star entertainment around them meant the girls essentially became the center of a multi-million-dollar business. The direct-to-video movies, merchandising deals, clothing lines, books, interviews, these projects turned them into a brand. The twins weren't just actors anymore, they were products. And that level of pressure shows up in a family, even when the intentions are good. By the mid-90s, their parents' marriage began to crack. The demands of fame, the money, the schedules, and the constant attention reportedly created tension at home. Their father leaned into the empire that was forming around his daughters. Their mother struggled with the idea of her children being pushed so hard at such a young age. When the divorce was finalized in 1995, the girls were only 7. While the breakup wasn't officially blamed on their careers, people close to the family have said the strain from managing 2 child stars played a major role. Around this time, the twins' workload accelerated even more. Instead of taking a breather, they launched into It Takes Two, the You're Invited tapes, and a steady stream of TV movies and specials. They became the faces of everything from toothbrushes to backpacks. Their image was everywhere: magazine covers, collectible dolls, posters, clothing racks, even perfumes. It was impossible for them to just exist without being watched. And this sort of lifestyle has consequences. The twins became accustomed to adulthood-level responsibilities long before they were teenagers. They attended business meetings, sat in on creative discussions, and were expected to carry projects that entire teams depended on for income. When most kids were going to recess, they were being shuttled between tutors, trailers, and sets. On top of that, every milestone of their lives, puberty, friendships, insecurities, played out in a spotlight they never asked for. Their appearances were scrutinized. Tabloids obsessed over their bodies before they were even 14. They didn't get privacy because their fame had become too profitable. All of this sets the stage for the unraveling that came next. By the time they entered their teenage years, the cracks in their foundation had already formed, and the world would soon watch those cracks widen in ways that made it clear the price of their success had been far greater than anyone realized. What happened when the pressures of fame started to collide with adolescence is a story that pushed both Mary-Kate and Ashley into territories far darker than anything they experienced as children, and it shaped the rest of their lives. The public breakdown. By the time Mary-Kate and Ashley stepped into their teenage years, the pressure that had been building since infancy finally started to show. They had been global brands before they were even old enough to tie their own shoes. And that kind of spotlight doesn't just fade when a kid turns 18. If anything, it intensifies. And that's exactly what happened in 2004, the year everything took a turn. That summer, as the twins prepared to start classes at New York University, Mary-Kate checked herself into a treatment facility. She was dealing with an eating disorder, along with rumors of substance-related issues that tabloids dissected daily. Instead of letting her focus on recovery, the media treated it like a spectacle. Every grainy photo, every shaky camera angle, every comment about her body became front-page material. It was relentless and deeply intrusive, especially for someone who was barely stepping into adulthood. And it didn't end there. A few years later, in 2007, Mary-Kate faced kidney problems serious enough to make headlines. It was another reminder that her health had been under strain for a long time. When she did speak about that period years later, she hinted that staying silent about personal struggles had only made everything harder. Growing up, she had been taught to hold everything in, to push through, to perform no matter how she felt. That coping mechanism eventually collapsed under its own weight. Her time at NYU didn't go the way she hoped either. Mary-Kate tried to blend in like a normal college student, but the paparazzi followed her everywhere. Her relationships were stalked by tabloids. When she dated Stavros Niarchos III, who came from old money and was a fixture in the celebrity party scene, things got messy fast. She later learned he was dating Paris Hilton at the same time. The heartbreak sent her retreating from the East Coast entirely. She left NYU and returned to Los Angeles, exhausted by the constant public commentary about her life. All of this happened while she and Ashley were still figuring out who they were without the machine that had controlled their childhood. And that's the part people often forget. They never chose fame. They were placed into it before they understood language. By the time they were old enough to express their own feelings, the expectations were already set. The world had built an empire around their faces, their names, their likeness. An empire that didn't slow down just because they were struggling. The criticism was brutal. If Mary-Kate gained weight, tabloids claimed she was healing. If she lost weight, they implied something darker. Ashley wasn't spared either. Even though she kept a lower profile, she still got pulled into the commentary simply because they were twins. The public treated both sisters like characters instead of real people. So in their early 20s, they made a decision that surprised a lot of people, but made complete sense for them. They left acting behind. They had spent their entire lives on film sets or in boardrooms, so stepping away from that world wasn't a rejection of Hollywood. It was survival. That's when they shifted their careers into fashion. The row launched quietly, almost secretly, and reflected who they had become. Nothing flashy, no celebrity endorsements, no logos plastered everywhere, just craftsmanship, structure, and intention. Clothing that whispered rather than shouted. The brand became a way for them to exist without constantly being seen. Over the years, it grew into one of the most respected labels in the luxury industry, earning awards and recognition from people who didn't care about their fame, only their work. Alongside their fashion careers came a lifestyle shift. They avoided social media. They rarely gave interviews. They declined offers to reprise Michelle Tanner in Fuller House, even though fans begged for it. They weren't trying to escape their past. They simply didn't want to live in it anymore. And yet, even with all these efforts to create a quieter life, the public fascination never fully faded. People still wondered how much their childhood shaped their adult struggles, how much of their health issues were tied to the stress they endured, how much of their decision to step back was about freedom versus self-protection. Because while this period marked the start of Mary-Kate's public struggles, it was also the beginning of a private unraveling that would eventually lead her into a relationship and eventual marriage that added a whole new layer of complexity to her life. The marriage nightmare. Mary-Kate met Olivier Sarkozy in 2012 at a small gathering in New York. He was in his early 40s, she was in her mid-20s, and the age gap instantly caught people's attention. But the two didn't seem bothered. He came from a world of high finance, shaped by European politics and old money expectations, while she had already lived several lifetimes in Hollywood before turning 25. On paper, they were an odd pairing. In real life, they settled into each other's lives more easily than anyone expected. By 2015, the relationship had progressed into marriage. Their wedding was intentionally tiny, held in a private home with only close friends and a quiet ceremony. Mary-Kate had spent her childhood being watched by millions, so choosing something intimate made sense. For a moment, it looked like she'd carved out a safe corner of normal life. Interviews she did around that time made it clear she enjoyed the balance she'd created, stepping away from acting, building her fashion empire, spending weekends riding horses, cooking meals, and navigating life with her two stepchildren. It was a calmer existence than anyone imagined for her. That sense of stability didn't last. When the pandemic arrived in early 2020, their marriage cracked in the most public and unexpected way. New York City was shutting down. Fear was everywhere, and people were scrambling to figure out how to stay safe. In the middle of all that chaos, Olivier made a decision that blindsided Mary-Kate. He decided to move his ex-wife, his two kids, and even his mother into the Hamptons home he shared with Mary-Kate. His explanation, according to people close to the situation, was that he wanted everyone together in one place, where he could protect them during the lockdown. Whether he meant well or not, the result was painful. Mary-Kate suddenly found herself sharing a home with her husband's ex-wife and extended family in the middle of a global crisis. The house itself was large, roughly 4,000 square feet with several bedrooms. But physical space wasn't the issue. The emotional strain was the real problem. Being quarantined under the same roof as her husband's ex-family placed her in an uncomfortable position she'd never imagined. Friends said she tried to remain calm at first, but the tension grew. The situation became even more complicated when she learned that Olivier had quietly ended the lease on their $30,000 a month Manhattan apartment without warning her. At a moment when New York was on lockdown and people were trying to avoid leaving their homes, she had to find a new place to live. Mary-Kate tried to file for divorce in April 2020, but New York's courts were essentially frozen, only processing emergency matters. She attempted to file an emergency order, explaining that she believed she was being pushed out of her home and needed immediate legal protection. The request was denied. The court system wasn't ready to handle anything outside the most urgent pandemic-related situations, and her filing had to wait until late May when the courts reopened. During that limbo period, she reportedly stayed outside the city with Ashley and a few close friends. People around her described the environment she'd left behind as overwhelming. It wasn't just the living arrangements or the lease issue. There were deeper incompatibilities that had been building for years. One of the most significant was their view of having children. Mary-Kate had reached a point where she was open to the idea of becoming a mother. Olivier, however, felt firmly done with that phase of life. He had already raised his 2 children and had no interest in starting over. Those around them said this disagreement had created stress long before the pandemic. And when everything else fell apart in 2020, it became one more sign that their paths were moving in different directions. The divorce negotiations stretched across much of that year. Both sides had strong legal teams, but Mary-Kate had gone into the marriage with an extremely solid prenuptial agreement. Her personal wealth, built through decades of business ventures with Ashley, remained protected. By January 2021, the divorce was finalized. After almost 9 months of navigating lawyers, pandemic restrictions, and intense emotional strain, she emerged from the marriage with her financial security intact, but her personal life completely shaken. Even after the paperwork was signed, the emotional fallout lingered. Mary-Kate had invested years into a relationship that she hoped would give her stability after a childhood and adolescence defined by work, scrutiny, and pressure. Instead, she ended up facing one of the most stressful periods of her life during a global crisis, while the entire world watched the story unfold through leaked documents and reports from unnamed sources. And yet, for all the chaos surrounding the divorce, the real turning point for Mary-Kate wasn't the legal battle or the public spectacle. It was something deeper, something tied to a pattern that had been shaping her entire life from childhood through adulthood. The deepest pain. Here's what many people overlook when talking about everything the Olsen twins went through. With all the chaos that surrounded their early lives, all the pressure they grew up under, and all the public attention they never asked for, there was one person who consistently showed up for them. Someone who treated them like real kids instead of tiny business assets. Bob Saget was that person. He played their on-screen dad, but over the years he quietly took on a role that was much bigger than a sitcom character. Even after Full House ended, Saget kept in touch with them. Friends who knew him well talked about how protective he was of the twins, almost like they were 2 extra daughters he somehow acquired along the way. He had a natural way of making them feel safe, which is saying something considering how much of their childhood was spent performing, posing, and being watched by the world. When the cameras stopped rolling, he remained a steady presence in their lives, checking in on them even when they stepped away from the industry completely. That's why January 9th, 2022 hit so hard. Saget was found unresponsive in his Orlando hotel room while he was on tour. He was 65. The news was shocking, partly because there had been no warning signs. He had been performing, laughing with fans, doing interviews, and living a normal life just hours earlier. People closest to him said he had seemed happy, energetic, and excited about the tour. Then, suddenly, he was gone. For Mary-Kate and Ashley, the loss was personal in a way that didn't require public explanation. They didn't run to speak out or share emotional statements online. Instead, they did something more meaningful. They showed up at his memorial service. Despite rarely attending public events, despite avoiding Hollywood gatherings for years, they made sure to be in the same room as the people who loved him. It was one of the few moments in recent years where the entire Full House cast reunited, and the twins quietly slipped into that circle to honor someone who had been a real anchor during the most confusing years of their lives. The grief around Saget's death seemed to bring a lot of things full circle. It highlighted how few adults from their childhood could genuinely be trusted. Most of the people around them back then were directors, producers, agents, or executives who saw them as a brand instead of children. Saget stood out because he didn't need anything from them. He wasn't part of their business empire. He didn't profit from their fame. He simply cared about them without conditions. And when he passed, the absence of that protection became even more noticeable. They'd already lost so much: privacy, normalcy, control over their own lives. And then one of the few safe figures they had was gone too. It made the long list of earlier hardships feel even heavier. Because the tragedy of the Olsen twins isn't just about the headlines people remember. It's about how those moments stacked on top of each other from the time they were babies. Their careers began before they could walk. They were part of a hit show before they could form memories. Their working lives started before most kids learned to speak in full sentences. Everything about their early world revolved around schedules, lighting cues, hitting marks, and keeping a massive audience entertained. As they got older, the childhood pressure only transformed into a different kind of weight. They became the faces of a billion-dollar business before they even learned long division. Their likenesses were printed on merchandise, dolls, posters, clothing lines, movies, books. An empire built around two little girls who never had the chance to figure out who they were outside of the brand attached to their names. And while the world saw cheerful publicity photos, behind the scenes, things were messy and stressful. Their parents' marriage fell apart. The expectations grew. The spotlight intensified. By the time they reached their teenage years, the cracks in that carefully crafted image were impossible to hide. Mary-Kate struggled with the emotional aftermath of growing up under constant scrutiny, and the developing eating disorder she eventually sought treatment for was dissected publicly as if it were entertainment. Every pound she lost or gained became a headline. Tabloids ran stories about her appearance almost daily. Strangers judged her body in ways that would be invasive for any adult, let alone someone barely into adulthood. At the same time, both twins were trying to figure out how to transition into their own identities. They pursued fashion not because it was trendy, but because it allowed them to work behind the scenes instead of being the faces of a brand. They created something minimalist and quiet, the opposite of the noisy fame they grew up with. They designed clothing for comfort and craftsmanship rather than attention. The row was their way of building a world where they didn't have to smile for cameras or perform on cue anymore. But even after stepping back from acting, the public attention didn't disappear completely. Their relationships were still talked about. Their weight was still scrutinized. Their choices were still analyzed. And when Mary-Kate's marriage to Olivier Sarkozy fell apart in 2020, the whole thing unfolded in the middle of a global pandemic, which only amplified the chaos. Suddenly, her private struggle became a public timeline filled with headlines about emergency petitions, housing disputes, and dramatic living arrangements involving her husband's ex-wife. It was a very personal breakdown happening under circumstances nobody could have predicted. All of that happened after years of earlier pressure, earlier trauma, earlier losses. And then came the death of Bob Saget, a reminder that time kept moving forward, but some support systems didn't. What stands out the most now is how the twins have chosen to live. They didn't just step out of the spotlight, they avoided it entirely. No Instagram, no TikTok, no public oversharing, no reality shows, no attempts at reviving their childhood fame. Their world today looks deliberately small and intentionally quiet. Their fashion brand is steady and successful, but it doesn't require them to be public figures. Ashley got married in a private ceremony attended by only a few close people. Mary-Kate has kept her post-divorce life almost entirely off the radar. They rarely make public appearances unless absolutely necessary. And when they do, they're guarded but polite. People who have seen them recently often describe something similar. Their expressions, once bright and playful as toddlers on a sitcom set, now look thoughtful, reserved, and careful. They smile, but it's usually small and subtle, the kind you share with people you trust, rather than with the entire world. Their younger sister Elizabeth, who grew up watching their fame from the outside, has talked about the chaos of their childhood in ways that make it clear how unusual all of it was. She stepped into acting later and on her own terms, with the benefit of seeing firsthand how dangerous fame can be when it starts too young. She often credited her sisters with teaching her how to maintain boundaries and protect her private life, something Mary-Kate and Ashley had to learn the hard way. Now, in their late 30s, they've built something that resembles peace, but that peace exists because they keep the world at arm's length. Every boundary they set is a response to the years when they had none. Every moment of privacy is something they had to fight for. Every choice to stay quiet comes from decades of being watched too closely. What do you think about the Olsen twins? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. While you're still here, check out the next video that pops up on your screen.